Hello and welcome to NewsX. I'm Joshua Barnes and today I'm joined by a very special guest who needs absolutely no introduction, but if you're one of the very few who hasn't read, heard or watched something of William Dalrymple, then he's an award-winning historian, also a podcaster, also many different things across multiple different mediums. But William, thank you very much for having us here today.
Thank you for coming.
Really appreciate you welcoming us into your home. The first question I wanted to ask you is about yourself and your own fascination with India. Of course, your father has history here as well, but what does India mean to William Dalrymple?
Well, I first turned up here spectacularly ignorant and unknowing of any of the history or any of the background, aged 18, and I'm still here now, age 59. So it certainly appealed. I've been here 40 years. I think what India means to me changes every few years because, I mean, it's been such a long time I've been living here. And I've had many different careers while I've been here. I've been a foreign correspondent. I've run a literary festival. I still run a literary festival. I've been a photographer, a historian, a travel writer. But India, I still feel, I mean, for a writer, which is what I have been at all stages of my life, it feels slightly like being a child in a sweet shop. There is so much that is of interest. I've spent the last 20 years writing about the East India Company, but over the last 5 years, disappeared down a rabbit hole of ancient India. Every bit as interesting, I mean, if not more so than the stuff I've been doing for the last 20 years. And I just feel that kind of India is so vast and its history is even vaster that I could spend another 10 lifetimes here and still not run out of material to write about and books to podcasts to articles to TV shows. I mean, it's so rich, this country, in every way, geographically, temporally, culturally. It's. I haven't even begun to touch the subject in 40 years. I haven't even begun to touch the surface in 40 years. There's so much left to discover.
Looking at what you have discovered and looking at your recent work, as you mentioned, over the last 5 years, this project, the book that we're here to talk about, The Golden Road, it's vastly earlier than the previous stuff that you've done on the East India Company.
Correct.
In terms of looking back that far and not just looking over decades or centuries, you're looking at millennia. How was that journey for you? And I also want to learn from you where the moment of discovery was. I know Angkor Wat was somewhere where the idea came to you, but can you expand on that for us?
This book is material I've been very interested in since I first turned up aged 18. When I was a teenager, I used to go on archaeological excavations. It was always prehistory that really ignited me. My first trip to London, I was born and brought up in Scotland, and I begged and pleaded with my parents to take me to the Tutankhamun exhibition, which was on in the British Museum in 1970 or something like that, when I was 5 or 6. And I remember that first trip to London. It was a kind of dazzling moment, but the clearest memory is that death mask of Tutankhamun. So when I came to India, I came as an enthusiastic young archaeologist who was about to go up to Cambridge to study archaeology. And the things I made a beeline for when I first came here were the early sites like Sanchi and Ajanta and Ellora, these places where you could really feel and touch and see the distant Indian past. And somehow, I don't know, in subsequent years, I got diverted onto the 18th century and the whole extraordinary story of colonialism, particularly the story of the East India Company, how one English company bizarrely takes over the richest country on earth using entirely nefarious means. And that was a story which, I disappeared into for 20 years and worked with an extraordinary man who just died called Bruce Warnell, who was a brilliant, brilliant Persian scholar. He could read all the extraordinary Mughal documents. I concentrated on the English stuff. And together, really, this was a joint project. We wrote these 4 books. I was doing the writing, but he was doing a lot of the translation of these extraordinary sources that no one else could read. And then after his death, this whole project was over. 20 years had passed, and I wanted to do something completely different. So I went back to my first love, in a sense, which is this very early, distant period of history. And you're right, Angkor Wat was a place where it all came together. I was looking around, wasn't quite sure how to frame a book on the ancient Indian past. And it's a very contested period. I don't know how far you're aware of the various culture wars running about the ancient Indian past. And I didn't want to just end up sort of in a trench fighting an established position. I wanted to do something that was slightly different from the current debates about, for example, the Aryan invasion theory and so on. And this idea of the diffusion of Indian ideas out of India was the idea that appealed to me. And there, Angkor Wat is the place that you can see it instantly. You are, whatever it is, 6,000 miles east of India in the middle of the Mekong Delta. In many ways, a completely different world. And yet here on the walls of this most extraordinary temple, which once was the largest Hindu temple in the world. I mean, it is still the largest Hindu temple in the world, except that it's now a Buddhist temple. It's changed its religion. But it was originally a Vishnu temple, and as such, in its original conception, no Hindu temple since has ever come close to its size. And yet when you wander around the galleries, although you're so far from India, there are stories that were first told on the banks of the Ganges and the Yamuna, stories of the Battle of Lanka and the Ramayana, stories of the Battle of Kurukshetra and the Mahabharata, stories of Krishna and the gopis set in Mathura, which is only, 2 hours south of here by car. And trying to understand how all these Indian ideas left this country and took root elsewhere was what occupied me during COVID. I was locked up in this house with my library next door and just read and read and read. And in a sense, a lot of this is very obvious, particularly to Indian people. I mean, everyone knows that Buddhism spread throughout Asia to China, to Korea, Japan, on to Mongolia and Siberia. Everyone knows that there's Hinduism in Bali and that Angkor Wat is this extraordinary monument to ancient India, although it's located in Cambodia. It was just putting all these pieces together, because often they're studied in different silos. So you have the story of Buddhism being told by one set of people, often connected with the story of the Silk Road in China. You have the story of Sanskritization and the coming of Indian literature and Hinduism to Southeast Asia, told by a different group of scholars. And the whole story of Indian mathematics heading west to become the number system we all use today, the nearest thing we have to a universal human language developed in this country. All these things I thought needed bringing together. And oddly enough, although there's many brilliant Indian scholars at work producing spectacular books every year, I don't think there's been a book like this which really tries to gather the full expansion of Indian civilization out of India since, I don't know, Ale Basham's The Wonder That Was India in the 1950s. And I had such a wonderful time, best of all, traveling. I mean, there's no greater pleasure than to go off to Angkor or to Borobudur in Indonesia, or follow the way that the Indian number system traveled first to Afghanistan and then to the Arab world and then to North Africa and finally to Europe via Italy. These sort of stories have occupied my holidays and travel plans since COVID. And then the labor of just pulling it all together and trying to tell this story in a coherent manner. And it took longer than any other book I've written to get right. I had a whole year after I finished the first draft correcting and recorrecting and fact-checking and recorrecting it again, partly because this was material that I had been for 20 years a specialist in the colonial period. This is a very different era of history. And I was very worried that there was every potential to getting things wrong. So I sent it off to scholars after scholar who kindly looked at it and made corrections. And right up until the last minute, literally, there was one friend of mine who's a scholar of ancient Tamil. And his comments, 20 pages of them, appeared the day after I'd sent the proofs to the publishers. So I had to get them back again, make further corrections to all my Tamilian spellings and so on, and adding extra bits to the bibliography that he'd suggested, and so on. In many ways, this is a much more difficult period to write about than the colonial period. Colonial period, you are spoilt with sources. The British Library in London alone has 30 miles of East India Company papers. There's as much again in the National Archives here. And then you go to people's own houses and there are yet more sources. But with the ancient period, you're really scraping around for materials. And there's whole periods of 100 years where there's nothing. There's potsherds and epigraphy and some very, very sort of ambiguous evidence, often from coins or archaeological data. And then suddenly, what's marvelous is sometimes the lights just go on. So, for example, the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, he comes to India, he writes an incredible travel account, plus he has a biographer called Hu Li, who writes another account, so you get not one but two sources. And suddenly everything is brightly lit. You can meet the people, you can see the University of Nalanda, the towering spires, the wonderful library, and then the lights go out and it's not for another 100 years until you have an account as good as that. So it was much more difficult, particularly to get detailed biographical stories of real people. But I think in the end, the book has come together after a lot of labour. There were long periods when I was despairing I was going to be able to do this, but it's out now and it's had a very warm reception. So I'm very grateful for that.
We're all very glad that you managed to get it together. In terms of the idea that India is the ancient Greece of Asia, which is something that's been said since your book has come out, and also looking at the expansion of India through religion, through, like you said, astrology, astronomy, the numeral system that we use. How has that spread worked? And also, it's the Golden Road. How does that compare to the Silk Road, which is something that has been spoken about a lot? This is almost an unravelling of that idea and sort of presenting a new idea. Can you explain that for us?
So there are certain parts of the world which took on the big questions of humanity. Why are we here? How big is our world? What is our relationship with the gods, with the heavens? How do we understand our place on earth? What's our conception of duty and morality? Ancient Greece is one of those. And that's very well known, thanks to the British and the colonial project, which made everybody study the classics and so on. Ancient China is another one. And in the last 30, 40 years, China's been very good at telling a story through the Silk Road. And this image has been created of China as the terminus of all the world's early trade routes and how everything ended up in Chang'an and modern Xi'an. While India has been slightly left out of all this. Indians know that they have this great and ancient culture. They know that it's the source of mathematics, and they know the great Indian mathematicians like Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. But in a weird way, no one outside India has taken this in. You and I both went to school in Britain, and we learned about people like Pythagoras and Archimedes by the age of 6 or 7. But Brahmagupta or Aryabhatta simply don't figure in English curriculums, or anywhere else in the world for that matter. So I think the Indian story, while known here in India, has not travelled in an odd way, in the way that the Chinese story or the Greek story has. And people in America simply don't know about the wisdom of ancient India, the inventions that were made here that travelled around the world, and the sophistication of ancient Indian thought. And often, I think, in the Indian diaspora, you get a frustration and a muddle. So you get the character in the Sanjeev Bhaskar Goodness Gracious Me series who says everything comes from India, Leonardo da Vinci, India, the royal family, India, and so on. And I think this book is an attempt to, in a sense, give a very clear factual basis for that. To say clearly, without sort of a nationalist spin, without sort of being a tub-thumping India first sort of nationalist, that all the amazing things that India did. And you don't have to bring in the kind of stuff of WhatsApp forwards from uncles claiming that there were nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata or helicopters in the Ramayana or whatever it is. Because the true story is extraordinary. And the sophistication of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, the way that their number system went to the Arab world and then to Europe, the whole story of how Buddhism left this country, took over the whole of Central Asia and China and then Japan and Korea, the whole story of how Hindu kingship and Sanskrit came to dominate Southeast Asia, so that all the kings there began to name themselves in Sanskrit names and to compare themselves to figures in Indian literature and Sanskrit literature. These are extraordinary stories, and so to tell them clearly in a way that is immediately appealing and attractive, but which is factually clear and verifiable. Not quite a half, but I think a third of this book is footnotes. To avoid getting tangled in any arguments with scholars, I produced very, very clear evidence for every assertion made in this book. And I hope that this book will provide a service, just stating in a very simple, factual, uncomplicated and uncontroversial manner the extraordinary way that Indian thought left this country and travelled. It's not a story, it's not a history of India, this book. It's a history of how Indian ideas left this country and went elsewhere.
And the impact that they've then had moving forward.
Exactly that.
And I think what the book does is it really does display the importance of India in so much of our lives. And another ancient civilization that we look at, and especially us growing up in Europe and in Britain, the Roman Empire is something that we study a lot more than anything that you've mentioned in the book. I want to look at that trade between India and the Roman Empire and the wealth that was transferred as well.
This is very, very important. And as I say, China's been very good at sort of making itself the centre of world trade. And at this moment in London, there are two exhibitions. There's the Silk Road exhibition at the British Museum, and there's the Silk Road Oasis show at the British Library. And these are fantastic shows. I mean, I don't want to in any way knock them. But there's an India-shaped hole in both of them, because India in the early centuries was the principal intermediary with the Roman Empire and with the Western classical world. And while Rome and China never had direct relations and never exchanged embassies, there were annual enormous fleets leaving Roman Egypt and traveling down the Red Sea, and it would take only 2 months to get from the Red Sea coast all the way to Kerala or Gujarat or the mouth of the Indus, and then back again when the monsoon reverses as it does every year. You can come back with equal speed in 2 months once you learn to ride the monsoon. So India is blessed by having this extraordinary monsoon network that allowed sailors to move at speed with the monsoon winds and to cross the oceans with great speed and safety and arrive the far side and make fortunes. And it's now completely clear that India was, in fact, the number one trading partner of the Roman Empire and vice versa, to the extent that Pliny, a Roman naval commander of the 1st century, complains that all the world's gold is draining into India's pocket. So the name the Golden Road is my own invention, but to try and use it as a symbol of the way that the gold of the West came to India. And then once Rome falls, there's a major economic crisis in India, because like Saudi Arabia, as if everyone suddenly went on battery cars, suddenly the easy source of money that you've had for a long period of time suddenly is cut off dead. So what happens in the 4th and 5th century when Rome goes down is that Indians have to pivot eastwards. And you have the beginning of major trading voyages to what's called Savarnabhumi, the lands of gold, which means mainland Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, then through the Mekong Delta and through the Malacca Straits to Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and finally China. And you find it's at this period in the 5th and 6th century, when Indian voyages begin to become very regular to the east, that you get Buddhism and Hinduism adopted in Southeast Asia. And suddenly there are Brahmins in these courts. They're using a South Indian form of writing, the Pallava Grantha, which is the southern Brahmi, it's the southern form of the Brahmi writing. And that's the basis for every single written script in Southeast Asia. Lao, Thai, Mon, Pew, all the different ancient scripts of Southeast Asia are based on this one form of Brahmi developed in Kanchipuram in Tamil Nadu. And it spreads throughout the region. And these are terribly important stories. This is how Southeast Asia connects with India. And again, I think Indians are aware that, for example, the Ramayana is very important in Southeast Asia, but often they're a bit hazy about how it got there, what brought it. And what's interesting is it wasn't conquest. I mean, most ideas in history move by someone marching into somebody else's country, killing the existing king, setting up an empire and imposing their will. What's interesting about India's spread is that by and large, there are exceptions to this. For example, Sri Lanka is conquered by both the Pallavas and the Cholas of South India. But by and large, these ideas move through the sheer sophistication of these ideas, how the degree to which people want to be part of this. They read the Mahabharata and they get so charmed by it that they want to make their courts like Yudhishthira. They want to have armies as powerful as that of Hanuman in the Ramayana. And so these ideas, by their allure and their sophistication, take over great chunks of the world. And Indian ideas penetrate very deeply into these recesses.
Looking at the success of the Golden Road, of course, it's not been out for long, but it has been extremely successful, specifically here in India as well. It's something I wanted to sort of pose to you. One, is that a surprise? And two, as a Brit who's now living in India, telling Indian history, how do you think that line has been trodden, and how do you think the reception has come about, and why do you think it's been so widely received?
So I've been living here 40 years, and when I first started writing books like City of Gins in the 1990s, people were, I think, a bit surprised to find a Brit writing about this part of the world. But I think people have got used to me by now. I've been churning these things out every 5 years for 40 years now. And I think it's been well over 20 years that I've sold most of my books in India, rather than initially my audience was both consciously in my head and also actually in the marketplace was in Britain or in America, in the Anglophone world. Since the time probably of White Mughals in 2002, most of my sales have been here, which is as it should be, because this is Indian history. And if it wasn't working here, I'd be doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. So all my books have been bestsellers here, but I haven't had anything like this book where, well, it's been number one in the bestseller list for now 12 weeks, and it's still there. So fingers crossed it'll be there a bit longer.
Thoroughly deserved as well. You end the Golden Road with a question. Could it happen again? Is this the new golden age for India? And can it be the new golden age for India with so much uncertainty geopolitically around the world?
Well, I think economically, it definitely will be. That's no longer a question. Any economist you talk to anywhere in the world will say that by the end of this century, that there will be three big economies in the world. One is America, one is India, and the other is China. Which of those three will be number one is a question that no one can answer. I think if I had been putting money on it 10 years ago, I'd have said probably China. But China has faltered, and India has grown in that time. The other surprise is the way that America has stayed in the game, in a sense. But whether it does under Trump, we'll see. Who knows? This is all unknowable. But what I think is, I mean, you know, in the real world, any amazing or terrible things can happen, and none of us can see into the future. But barring some sort of meteor strike or some terrible natural catastrophe or pollution, which is already bad, getting so bad that no one can go out of their houses, or India is actually very negatively affected by the pollution and the smog, and its economy suffers. Barring all that, all the indicators are that India economically will be one of the main powerhouses of the world, maybe even sooner than the end of the century, maybe even within the next decade. Whether India will have the same political influence and how far its cultural influence will spread is a more difficult question to answer, and we'll see. I think, in general, if a country is very rich and very well educated, you can expect to see cultural wonders. It's when a country is rich and well educated and open. Openness is another one. I think many Indian nationalists, when they think of the Indian past, think of it as a sort of hermetically sealed box of Indianness that you know, in a sort of vacuum pack or something. It's not like that. If you look at ancient India, go, for example, to the Ajanta caves and look at the pictures of the courts, there are Sogdians, Scythians, Persians, Egyptians, Ethiopians. The world was coming to India. And that partly is why, for example, the mathematics and the science is so extraordinary, because they're bringing in science from Persia, from Babylon, from Greece, and then taking it 5 steps forward. Just like today, if you are, you know, a serious scholar, you have to first gather all the information that the world has on any given subject before you can take it a step or 2 steps forward. And ancient India was no different from that. It's when India is most open to the world and most cosmopolitan and humble enough to take in ideas and improve them that you get the greatest results. So the cultural question, I can't answer. Economically, though, I'm very clear that India will be a superpower by the end of the century, barring some unforeseen horror.
William Dalrymple, thank you very much. The book, of course, it's extremely popular. I recommend anybody who's interested in Indian history to take a look at it. Thank you for explaining a little bit. There's of course a lot more that goes into it and a lot more to discover. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. William, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for coming.
And we look forward to seeing your next work and seeing where you go, how far back or where you go in the middle.
I'm not sure what I thought I'd return to the colonial period and maybe write about the Opium Wars next, but I've got so excited about this period. I'm quite keen to remain in the distant past and find some new way of exploring that.
Wherever you go, we look forward to seeing it. Thank you very much.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.